Hi guys! Tonight we slip back into the hot highland air of 15th century Ethiopia. Tuburai, surrounded by sandstone walls, that glow orange in the evening light, the smell of cumin and charcoal drifting lazily through open courtyards. The streets hum not with chaos, but with a kind of sleepy anticipation. Pulling carts over cobbles, priests in white cotton robes whispering scripture as they pass. You pause to admire the stonework of the palace towers, smoothed by centuries of wind and war. And behind one of those carved wooden doors someone watches everything, someone the world seems to have forgotten. Her name is Queen Eleni. And while her title may have softened with time into obscurity, her rule did not. 40 years. Tatian, how long she quietly, cunningly shaped the fate of a kingdom straddling cultures, climates, and continents. You probably would too last 2 weeks in her palace, much less 40 years in her shoes. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is where you are. Now, dim the light, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You start walking, no rush, through the chilly corridors of a hilltop palace built for empire, but run, tonight, by an aging woman in plain robes. No crown, no fanfare. But everyone who matters knows not to cross her. Queen Eleni does to sleep much these days. Neither do her enemies. Ethiopia, at this point in history, is less a country and more a loose braid of mountain kingdoms, shifting alliances and old dynastic pride. Its rulers claim descent from Solomon himself. Yes, that's Solomon, and the Queen of Sheba, whose Ethiopian name is Makede. It's in a land of proud lineages and long memories, and nobody forgets who your ancestors were. Unless, of course, you're Eleni. Because Eleni was Thai. Her early life is murky, filtered through legend and contradiction. But the strongest theory places her origins in the Christian kingdom of Nubia or a noble family of Armenian or Syrian stock, foreign. In other words, outsider. Married into royalty, not because of her pedigree, but because someone needed a smart alliance and fast. Historians still argue whether Eleni arrived in Ethiopia as a diplomatic bride or as a hostage with jewelry. The truth, as always, might be both. You feel the dust beneath your feet as you stroll through the palace garden. It's mostly stone paths and potted herbs, but there is a fig tree at the far end that Eleni insisted on planting herself. She said it reminded her of home. Nobody quite knew where that was. It's in the late 1400s, and the kingdom is both isolated and exposed. To the north, the Red Sea bustles with traders and raiders. To the east, Muslim sultanates rise with itchy borders and ambitions. To the west, just a forest and mystery. And at the center, the Solomonic court tries to pretend it's still the chosen ruler of all this. You pause at a low archway where pigeons roost. This is where the queen used to stand in the evening listening to the echoes from the city below. You can almost hear it now, market voices fading, the soft bells of mules, the rhythm of drums signaling dusk. Eleni did ascend the throne in a blaze of glory. She arrived through the side door, married to Emperor Zara Jacob, who was, a lot. His rule was long, often brutal, and obsessed with religious conformity. He burned heretics, reshaped church politics, and demanded public displays of piety that would exhaust a modern influencer. And yet, despite this fiery atmosphere, Eleni rose, not by demanding attention, but by offering insight. Slowly, carefully, relentlessly. Her first role was queen consort, ceremonial, smiling at festivals, keeping her opinions soft and her presence softer. But behind those quiet eyes, Eleni was taking notes. Who obeyed the emperor, who hesitated, who laughed a bit too hard at the wrong jokes. You pass a carved wooden bench half hidden by time. This, they say, is where she sat when the council met without her. Until one day they stopped meeting without her. Historians puzzle over the timeline. 1 minute she in a shadow behind the throne. The next she in holding the pen that signs trade agreements, selecting which priest leads which monastery, deciding when the emperor Gene relatives get to breathe fresh air again. How did she go from ornament to operator? The best clue is her mastery of languages. Eleni spoke Ge'ez, the sacred liturgical tongue, but also Arabic and allegedly a bit of Portuguese. That alone made her irreplaceable. In a court where translation meant power, she never waited for someone else to explain the message. She was the message. One scroll, preserved in a monastery outside Lake Tana, includes a line from a court official grumbling about the foreign queen who listens too closely, which might be the oldest way of saying Banshee and smarter than all of us, and we hate it. But Eleni wasn't interested in pleasing them. She was playing a longer game. When Zara Yacob died in 1468, the court expected her to disappear, maybe retire to a convent, maybe take up embroidery. Instead, she installed herself as regent. Quietly. Officially. Absolutely. You duck into a shadowed hallway now, candlelight dancing along walls that haven't changed in centuries. This is where she made her power felt. Not in open declarations, but in well-timed whispers. A marriage approved way. A tax forgiven. A general reassigned to a province far, far away. And she never stopped walking. Even in old age, Eleni insisted on touring the provinces, appearing in public with a dignity that made rebellion feel not just dangerous, but awkward. Her rule was marked by grand speeches or flashy wars. It was built of small precise acts, new extra shipment of grain here, a diplomatic letter there, a ceremony that started 5 minutes earlier than anyone expected. Because she expected them to adjust to her. And they did. The pigeons above you flutter once, then settle. Somewhere deep in the palace, you swear you hear the soft rustle of robes? Or maybe itching just a breeze coming in through the fig leaves. You continue along the quiet corridors, stone beneath your feet, and time pressing softly at your shoulders. You feel it, the weight of history, not in drama, but in the gentle grind of centuries. No spotlight shines here, no heroic statues, just drafty rooms and the quiet memory of someone who was never supposed to rule. Because Eleni was not born to be queen, and certainly not born to govern an empire. It's easy to forget how strange that was, in a time when royal bloodlines were guarded like treasure chests, and women were rarely trusted with anything more complicated than a feast menu. Eleni emerged, not through battle or birthright, but through sheer political gravity. She had a way of stepping into power the way most people step into a warm bath. Slowly, deliberately, as if it had been hers all along. She came to the Solomonic court as the bride of Emperor Zara Yacob, whose reputation for stern religious orthodoxy, and let's be honest, the occasional molten bomb preceded him. He had married other women, discarded them, punished them, even imprisoned them. And here comes Eleni, young, foreign, and fluent, in more languages than anyone expected. She should have vanished, but she did. The chroniclers of the time, writing in beautiful loops of GS script on animal parchment, mention her name in passing. Eleni, wife of the emperor. Later, Eleni favored by the court. Later still, Eleni who advised the council and was listened to. Those few words marked a slow, tectonic shift of her influence. And the truth is, no one in the palace could quite place her. She was from the Highland nobility, didn't belong to the old northern lineage. Her speech carried a faint accent, her manners a different rhythm. She prayed with everyone else, but some said she did it with her eyes open, as if she was also praying to possibility. Historians still argue whether she was Nubian, Syrian, or Armenian in origin. A few suggest she might have been brought to Ethiopia through diplomatic capture, a royal hostage polished into a jewel for court display. Others say she was a voluntary bride, sent by her people to forge ties with the Christian empire of the Highlands. But again, and this is a theme yet be noticed that Eleni herself never clarified. She let people speculate, and sometimes that's a better shield than armor. You pause at an arched doorway framed by worn frescoes. This was the queen in writing room. Not many people had a private scriptorium in those days, but Eleni, she made sure of it. She did, too. Big date letters, she annotated, she edited, she wrote. When embassies came calling, they often left with messages bearing her seal, sometimes even her handwriting. Daring a story about one Venetian diplomat who was shocked Cho find himself answering questions from the queen, not the emperor. Bah, she speaks like a scoundrel. He wrote in a letter home when hears more than she says, which is diplomats speak for, bo. I got outplayed by a woman, and this was just some token involvement. Eleni was running things. After Zara wa all were death, a ripple of anxiety passed through the court. The next emperor, Baida Mariam, was young, impulsive, and very much not ready. That left a dangerous power vacuum, and it took about a week for everyone to realize who filled it. Eleni stepped into the regency role without declaring it. She simply began doing the things no one else could do. She reviewed military domains, settled trade disputes, managed tax shipments, and wrote carefully worded invitations to foreign courts. Some people protested. She smiled at them and kept going. You round the corner now into what would have been a modest private chapel. Candles glow here too, though the flames are electric now, flickering out of LED, bulbs that flicker just enough to fool you. The air smells faintly of incense. Someone still burning frankincense on weekends perhaps? Or maybe the walls just remember. Eleni had her own ideas about faith. She was devout, no question, but not easily manipulated by it. She attended liturgies, sponsored monasteries, and sent gifts to abbots. But she also questioned interpretations, refused to fund witch hunts, and once reportedly rolled her eyes during a bishop ran prophecy. Quietly, of course. You sit in one of the wooden pews and imagine what she must have looked like here. Robes of thick cotton, maybe embroidered with subtle gold, hair bound in traditional Highland braids, expression calm, unreadable. She had a face carved for neutrality, a diplomatian dream. It revealed nothing unless she wanted it to. And that's in part of how she held on to power, not through grand proclamations, but by making herself indispensable. She knew what caravans were arriving, which generals had gambling debts, which priests were arguing over theology, and which ambassadors needed honeyed wine before they could sign anything. Therein and a scroll from the Aksumite archives. Faded and fragile, that mentions an incident where a neighboring noble tried to send a veiled threat to the young emperor. The letter was intercepted. Of course, Eleni read it, underlined the amusing parts, and then hosted the noble at a feast. By the end of dinner, the noble had gifted her 3 horses, a bolt of silk, and his nephew as a page. Not bad for someone who wasn't even supposed to be there. The wind picks up outside, rattling the narrow stained glass above the altar. You glance up. It's not much of a storm, but you imagine it anyway. Rain against tile, thunder, muffled by thick walls, and Eleni somewhere inside, sipping tea, listening to the rumble like E.T. just background music to whatever chessboard she's working on. You think about how strange it must have felt to the people around her. A woman not only advising the emperor, but often speaking for him. A foreign-born queen who knew the price of grain in Haran, the mood of monks in Lalibela. And the strangest part, she did to take the throne for herself. She never called herself empress. She didn't have to. Because Eleni understood something modern power chasers forget. You don't need a title when you already hold the pen. The corridors curve again, and you pass a rust-colored tapestry that barely clinging to the stone. If you blink, it might vanish entirely, just a relic half forgotten, like so many details of Elenian life. But if you keep looking, you start to notice what's woven into it. Wedding bands, phoenixes and a lion, Ethiopia, sacred beast, lie, wearing a slightly amused expression. You get the feeling it's in on the joke? Because tonight we step into one of Elenian's greatest gambits, the royal marriage that no one predicted. You imagine the royal court at the time like a particularly tense family dinner with incense. Everyone seated just so, pretending to get along but watching each other's and hands under the table. The Emperor Zara Yacob was hosting that dinner, metaphorically speaking, and at the far end sat the guests nobody knew what to do with. Foreign nobles, outsiders, stitch problems in fancy shoes. And then there was Eleni. No noble birth in the Solomonic line, no army behind her, but still she became empress. The story goes like this. Emperor Zara Yacob, brilliant and intense, had survived rebellions, near poisonings, and a rotating cast of wives and concubines, many of whom met unpleasant ends. His court was devout, suspicious, and as tangled as a pile of prayer beads. At one point, the emperor had over 200 women under royal protection. That sounds nicer than it actually was. And then he married Eleni, not for love. Historians suspect, for leverage. Why her? That's where the speculation begins. Some believe her people had access to Red Sea trade routes. Others think she had theological influence in distant Christian territories. T say she was simply too clever to remain unmarried and too dangerous to ignore. Historians still argue whether this was a match of convenience, diplomacy, or something stranger. An attempt by the emperor to surround himself with someone who didn't worship him. And here's the kicker. Eleni wasn't just married to Zarawakob, she became his confidant, his second brain. Not always his favorite, but always his equal in the room. You wander now into a long hall of tall windows. There ain't no glass, just stone-carved lattice that lets in the breeze. You can almost hear the palace gossip echoing through it. Soft, sharp, constant. In a place where alliances shifted with the moon and loyalty was measured in grain shipments, the sudden rise of Eleni made everyone nervous. The courtiers watched her closely, where she sat, who she spoke to, how often she visited the emperor's arena chambers. They expected her to rise quickly and fall faster. But Eleni didn't fall. She adjusted. She understood that palace life was less about flashing power and more about absorbing attention. She attended ceremonies with just enough gold to be noticed, but not resented. She spoke Ge'ez fluently, but used a translator in Arabic when she wanted to appear modest. She wrote letters in her own hand, but only when she knew they would circulate. One story from a later chronicler tells of an evening when the emperor was dining with foreign envoys, and Eleni interrupted. Not with food or music, but with a poem. A political poem. About lions. 18 always about lions in Ethiopia. The envoys were baffled. The emperor laughed so hard he spilled his honey wine. And the next week Eleni was entrusted with handling those same diplomats. You stop beside a carved wooden screen, the kind that hides a room from view but not from sound. Eleni liked those. She could listen without being seen, advise without appearing to dominate. It's an underrated skill in politics, carrying everything, reacting to nothing. And maybe that's what set her apart? Not just intelligence, timing. At one key moment, Zarawakob ordered the construction of a new palace wing, grand, gold-leafed, utterly unnecessary. Most advisors nodded. Eleni asked can it house refugees during a drought? Lammy laughed, and built it bigger, with extra storage, just in case. Her marriage to the emperor lasted about 15 years, longer than many of his alliances and most of his temper. Toward the end of his life he grew more paranoid, isolating himself from his own children. Eleni stayed close but rarely alone. She knew what happened to courtiers who lingered too long in a mad Kingian shadow. She kept her influence visible but deniable, just the way she liked it. Past a faded mural, a wedding scene probably, two figures beneath an arch, both wearing crowns. But the woman's face is half scrubbed away, worn down by time or intention. You wonder if it was Eleni, or if someone tried to erase her later. Because even now her legacy is fuzzy. Some later scribes elevated her to near sainthood, now wise matron, mother to the realm. Others barely mention her, as if admitting she had real power would set a dangerous precedent. But she left Mars, quiet ones. Eleni used her position as queen to reshape the court. She promoted scribes who valued diplomacy over dogma. She advised young priests to study languages, not just liturgy. She suggested, ever so gently, that the empire's future might depend more on trade and maps than on swords and sermons. Therein a small wooden box displayed behind glass in one of the palace rooms. Inside it, 3 objects. A copper comb, a smooth stoning pot, and a worn silver ring with no gem. They labeled simply, belongings of the empress. No one was quite sure if they were hers, but people still stopped to look. And you realized, Tachia, the strange beauty of her story. Eleni didn't leave behind declarations or monuments. She left behind outcomes. A smoother succession, a generation of slightly more literate monks, a kingdom that for a while didn't tear itself apart. As you step into the open air again, a breeze curls through the courtyard scented with lavender and something older. Wood smoke may be your time. Elenian marriage may have begun as a strategy, but in the end it became a platform, a foundation, a door that was supposed to open but somehow never closed. And through it, she quietly walked into history. The stone underfoot changes again, smoother, slightly worn at the edges, as you walk into a room that smells faintly of parchment, beeswax, and old ink. You be arrived at the nerve center of Elenian quiet empire, the royal archives, or what she left of them. Here is where you begin to understand the real engine behind her long reign. A court not of swords, but of secrets and scrolls. Picture it, a long cool chamber lined with carved shelves, no books in the modern sense, these are scrolls, stitched leather covers, folded parchments, some of them kept in hollowed-out wooden cylinders. The room isn't on grand, it doesn't need to be. The power here is silent, alphabetical and absolute. Eleni was no warrior queen, but make no mistake, she ran an intelligence network that would make modern spy agencies blush. She inherited a court where knowledge was fragmented and jealously guarded. Scribes and monks hoarded information like squirrels, and eunuchs, those underestimated bureaucratic magicians, ran the inner palace with the kind of precision only fear can buy. But Eleni knew something they did. The information becomes real power only when it's shared with just the right person, and no one else. One scroll now housed in a museum in Addis Ababa includes a strange little diagram. A flowchart, essentially names, arrows, dots indicating loyalty, it an unsigned but attributed to Elenian court. Some say it's a map of allies and spies. Others think it was a seating chart. Either way, you get the picture. She was keeping track. You glance toward a niche in the stone where a small clay jar once held ashes of shredded scrolls. Eleni didn't just collect knowledge. She destroyed it when necessary, a letter intercepted, a confession too revealing, a deal with the regional lord that needed forgetting. Down to dust it went. And that brings us to her unlikely allies. Eunuchs? In Ethiopian court life, eunuchs weren't just passive servants, they were gatekeepers, messengers, and sometimes the only men allowed into certain royal spaces. Eleni treated them not as furniture but as a secret cabinet. She gave them literacy titles, even land. In return, she had eyes and ears in every hallway, including the emperorian. There in a faded tale, half history, half gossip, of a eunuch named Beko, who once crossed a river on a log during a storm to deliver a single letter from Eleni. Its contents unknown, its effects a provincial rebellion ended overnight. Coincidence? Please? Historians still debate the structure of Elenian private network. Some believe she had formal spy masters, a kind of proto-intelligence service. Others argue she simply used the existing church and monastic communication routes to her advantage. But whichever it was, people talked. Eleni listened. And, speaking of the church, Crus, hence is where things get extra interesting. Eleni wasn't just lurking in the shadows of royal politics. She was reorganizing the very structure of spiritual authority. The Ethiopian Orthodox Church had long functioned as both a faith and a bureaucracy, and Eleni, despite being technically outside its hierarchy, inserted herself into doctrinal disputes with the precision of a seasoned theologian. She didn't lead sermons. She led outcomes. When rival bishops argued over scriptural interpretation, Eleni called for reflection. Then she quietly appointed the bishop whose cousin owed her a favor. When monks began to spread apocalyptic warnings, a group predicted the kingdom would fall by fire if women rule. Eleni didn't retaliate. She funded a new roof for their monastery. The fire never came. Now you pass a doorway curtained in faded blue. Behind it, her council chamber, a long rectangular room where cushions took the place of thrones, and courtiers were forced to sit at eye level. Eleni hated elevation, unless it was metaphorical. She believed power should be seen and heard, not hovered above. There, yet something remarkably modern about the way she ran things. No standing army of her own, no flashy public appearances, no grand declarations, just influence, maneuvered quietly like a cat weaving through the legs of furniture. always moving, always present. And sometimes, when influence didn't work, Eleni played her ass, paperwork. She was a master of decrees, small letters in phrasing, a name changed here, a date shifted there. Nian Batodin's royal order delivered. Just slightly too late? Itzian believes she once delayed a marriage proposal from a rival kingdom by 9 days, just long enough for a new alliance to be secured with someone else. Miscommunication. Or perfect timing. There's a scholar in Gondar who swears that nearly every royal decree between 1470 and 1515 bears Eleni and phrasing, not her name, just her unmistakable rhythm. Short, clipped commands with no room for error. Let the tray pass, let the water route be guarded, let the governor remain. You imagine her now in the corner of this chamber listening as two ministers argue over taxes. She doesn't interrupt. She waits until they've exhausted themselves, then softly points to a clause in a treaty they forgot existed. No drama, no thunderclap, just competence. And maybe that's why her court work. It wasn't inspired by fear. It was bound by a kind of elegant inevitability. You did to oppose Eleni because she would crush you. You did oppose her because you already lost before the meeting started. There in a little-known parchment in the monastery of Debre Libanos, never translated into English, that describes a court meeting where Eleni resolved 3 border disputes, approved a pilgrimage route, and had the palace baker replaced for undersalting the bread, all in the same afternoon. The tone of the text, admiring, exhausted, slightly terrified. And yet she rarely raised her voice. She did too. When you control the flow of information, you don't need to yell. You just need to whisper in the right ear at the right time. You turn toward the stone steps leading upward. They're narrow, slightly uneven. Designed, some say, to slow down anyone trying to charge through the palace. But tonight they're just part of the rhythm. Another heartbeat of the quiet empire. You begin to climb slowly, listening as the breeze returns, rattling palm leaves in the courtyard below. The scrolls, the secrets, the scribes, the silent nods behind curtains, they're all still here in the air. And as you reach the top of the stairs, you realize something. This was a woman who clung to power. She built it brick by quiet brick, and then she made it so boringly effective no one thought to take it away. The staircase narrows. As you reach the upper floor, opening onto a veranda, where the highland breeze slips in like a well-trained servant. Far below, the rooftops of the old palace stretch toward the hills. The haze of cook fires and dust blending the city into a watercolor of quiet life. But you are not here for the view. This is where the princes used to play, at least, before they turned into problems. Eleni's story isn't just one of strategy and scrolls. It's also a never-ending chess match with ambitious relatives, wayward sons and nephews, who thought ruling was their birthright and patience was for peasants. Welcome to royal family politics, Ethiopian edition. No one ever dies of boredom, but plenty come close to dying from poor timing. You pause by a low wooden bench where one such princeling reportedly sulked for 3 days after being passed over for command. Eleni didn't banish him. She gave him control of grain storage. Historians still argue whether that was a punishment or a test. Spoiler alert, he failed it. Now, the Solomonic dynasty prided itself on a direct lineage from King Solomon and the Queen of Sheba. That, impressive for the genealogy, charts and even more of a mess in practice. Everyone wanted to be next in line. Everyone could prove they were next in line. He who squinted at their unkala, second, wiver, father, just right. After Emperor Zara Yacob ben death, the throne passed to his son Baida Mariam, a teenager when crowned, and how should we say this gently? Not quite ready for the job. Eleni saw it coming. She spent the final years of her husband's life quietly building alliances, gathering information, and preparing for this exact moment. A young emperor met a regent, and guess who had been quietly acting like one for years. But just because Shizi secured her influence didn't mean things got easier. In fact, they got infinitely more delicate. Beta Mariam adored his mother, his biological one that is, but she had little political skill and even less patience. Eleni, on the other hand, had no children of her own, at least none that history records, that made her both less threatening and more expendable. a dangerous balance. And yet she pulled it off. Instead of framing herself as a rival to Baeda, Bariam's actual mother, Eleni positioned herself as his counselor, his spiritual guide, his steadying hand. When court arguments broke out, angry frequently, she was the one who cleared the room and served tea. When whispers of rebellion surfaced, she ordered extra grain shipments to the eastern provinces. Calm equals loyalty. But of course not everyone agreed with her methods. Several royal cousins, seeing a non-royal-born woman shaping imperial policy, started making noises. Some claimed she was too foreign, others accused her of witchcraft. Because, of course, what else do you accuse competent women of in the 15th century? One particularly vocal nephew, we can't call him Prince Doip, because that was indeed his name, decided to test the limits of Elene's power by declaring himself rightful heir. He gathered a few hundred supporters, staged a small rebellion, and sent a letter to the emperor demanding recognition. Eleni intercepted the letter. She did tapmane. She did raise an army. She invited Doip to dinner. Now this wasn't just any dinner. It was a feast in the grand hall, complete with musicians, roasted goat, and a carefully placed display of war trophies from earlier rebellions. She seated Doip between two generals who had once fought in the north, men who had very little interest in repeating the experience. The next morning Doip left the capital quietly and took a post as governor of a small border province known for leopards and not much else. You walk now into a long gallery. Empty chairs line the walls, arranged for some long-forgotten council. You can almost hear the murmurs of debate, the shuffle of sandals, the rustle of papyrus, and in the center, always calm, always listening, Eleni. But the rebellions didn't stop. That the thing about monarchy. You're always managing someone win expectations. If you appease one faction, another thinks you both grown weak. If you crush dissent too harshly, even loyalists start watching the exits. Eleni and solution. A balancing act so precise it bordered on acrobatic. She kept rival princes busy with ceremonial duties, leading pilgrimages, inspecting irrigation projects, reviewing translated scriptures, anything that felt like power but came with no real authority. Therein a letter fragmentary, but still decipherable, found in a monastery near Gojam. It's in from a young noble complaining that he's been but tasked with overseeing the royal hen. Something this was a metaphor. Others suspect Eleni actually put him in charge of poultry. Either way he did, top rebel. Yeah, here in Calabar, Eleni did TTM. Sideline threats, she reframed them. She took one notoriously arrogant young cousin, famous for saying he was but closer to Solomon than the emperor, then made him the official Bolti warder of ancestry. He was delighted, spent years making genealogical trees. No one asked for harmless trees. Historians still debate how Eleni managed to keep the royal family from self-destructing. After all, Ethiopian dynastic history isn't too exactly peaceful. Bloodlines have a habit of spilling blood, but somehow under her careful hand the family mostly stayed in line. She knew the leadership was about command, D was about containment. You pause in the gallery, read in far corner where the stone cools in the evening light. Someone has scratched a prayer into the wall. The words are faded but the tone is clear, a request for wisdom, patience, and the protection from nephews, same struggles, different century. And it's then not that Eleni hated the younger generation. In fact, she invested heavily in their education. She invited scribes to teach court children multiple languages. She sponsored religious instruction, but also insisted on lessons in agriculture, geography, and oddly, music theory. Therein a theory that she believed music soothed ambition. And maybe it did for a time. Because while Eleni didn't to win every battle, she won the war of continuity. She kept the royal family from devouring itself long enough for Ethiopia to stabilize. And when things got loud, when the princes squabbled and the generals huffed and the mothers wept, she waited for the silence. Then she acted. That chant, the thing with power, it doesn't always roar. Sometimes it waits until everyone else has tired themselves out. And then it whispers, now. You pass beneath a low stone archway and emerge into a smaller chamber, circular, with no windows, just a narrow slit of light that cuts across the floor like a lazy sundial. This is where messages were sent and received. Not the kind you trumpet in public squares, but the ones that travel under cloak in the dark with only a whispered name for delivery. Because tonight we tiptoe into the quieter parts of the end strategy. The part with spies, hidden scrolls, and enemies who never quite knew what hour to sleep. The truth is, for all her gentle wisdom and maternal diplomacy, Elle needed to survive 40 years at the top of an imperial court by trusting everyone. She survived because she didn't trust anyone, not completely, not always, and especially not those who smile too widely during feast days. You sit down on the edge of a sun-warmed step. From here, if you look carefully, you can still see a small carved emblem on the stone floor, an eye inside a circle. The emblem of her intelligence, courier service. Believe the A. Now, Ethiopian imperial politics in the 15th century didn't exactly feature spies in black hoods sneaking over palace walls. No grappling hooks, no poison rings, but it did feature scribes, monks, camel drivers, market women, and shepherds, a bit with a piece of news, each capable of tipping a balance. And Eleni organized them, not officially, not with any grand declaration. But bit by bit she gathered a web of messengers and informants who owed her everything. A forgiven tax, a healed wound, a place at court, small debts with large consequences. Therein a story of a letter, wrapped in goat hide and sewn into the saddle lining of a merchant Gian camel, delivered to a distant governor just before he pledged loyalty to a rival. Historians still argue whether the letter was a threat or a promise. What matters is that he changed his mind. Elin Yang gift once the just in reading people. It was in timing. She knew when to act, when to wait, and when to let fear do the heavy lifting. Often, all she had to do was not respond to someone's win letter, and the silence itself became a message. It seemed tempting to call this paranoia, but remember, Eleni had seen emperors betrayed by their own kin. She had watched court favorites fall in a single afternoon, all because they believed too deeply in someone else's smile. So she built her own safety net, quietly. One of her most reliable tools, religious envoys. Monks were allowed into every corner of the realm. They were welcomed in palaces, hosted by lords, kissed on the cheek by peasants. And many of them were deeply loyal to the queen. She funded their travels, restored their monasteries, and offered them books from the palace library. In return, they offered her news. Not gossip, information, harvest numbers, popular sentiments, the tone of a regional Christian sermons. And she kept detailed records, not just of enemies, but of people on the edge. A general with a new drinking habit. A tax collector, who suddenly wore more rings than his salary could explain. A provincial noble, who stopped mentioning the queen in name in prayer. She noticed it all. You move now into an adjacent chamber. One that once held the palace, Macom, carrier pigeon roost. Yes, carrier pigeons. Eleni and Caught had a network of them, trained to fly messages between hilltop monasteries and royal outposts. And while the idea of avian espionage might make you smile, it worked. One Venetian envoy even wrote back home about seeing a bird land beside a Crinean chair delivering a tiny scroll. Hey said, without a blinker. Hey wrote. Burn 10 smiled and ordered the wine ver. The scrolling contents, unknown. The wine, excellent. But not all her work was so subtle. When rebellion brewed in the east, Eleni sent 3 envoys. Not soldiers, but bullisanes, as her records call them. They arrived bearing gifts, attended sermons, and quietly took notes. Days later, the would-be rebel emir received a letter not from the emperor but from the queen. Cem believed the letter, quoted one of his own secret prayers. Word for word. He withdrew his troops by morning. You reach a narrow stairwell, descending now into the cooler part of the palace. Down here the air is thick with earth and memory. This is where intercepted letters were stored. Some burned, some copied, some simply filed away in case they became useful later. Eleni did need to punish everyone. She just needed everyone to remember she could. That Chan. Why her enemies slept lightly. There. A document. Too rare. Untranslated, held in a small monastery archive near Exum. It describes the Quenian practice of sending duplicate orders, worded slightly differently, to different commanders. A test to see who followed which instruction and how quickly the information leaked. One commander acted too soon and was reassigned to a mountain outpost with no name. Another hesitated and found himself demoted to grain overseer. Eleni never even raised her voice. She let the consequences speak. And still, there was kindness. She forgave one noblewoman who had corresponded with a rebellious cousin. Instead of exile or execution, she offered the woman a position, overseeing the Quinian textile stores. "You seem so interested in weaving," she said. The noblewoman never wrote another letter. Some say Eleni trusted no one. That's not quite right. She trusted those she had helped rise, those who owed their station to her. Loyalty earned through generosity was her favorite kind. It lasted longer. You ascend again now, climbing gently to the upper floors where the breeze slips through open shutters, carrying faint echoes of the distant market. You imagine the queen standing there, one hand on a wooden balustrade, the other wrapped around a letter. Her face calm, her thoughts unreadable, and you realize, Elle dipti now. She ruled through memory. She remembered who said what, who stayed silent, who blinked when she asked a simple question. And because she remembered, so did everyone else. In a kingdom of swords, she became the whisper that held the blade steady. The air shifts as you step into a wide chamber with an intricately carved ceiling, its beams still holding centuries of smoke from oil lamps long since gone out. This is the hall of foreign audiences, or was. Once it echoed with languages you couldn't place, full of traders in silk, diplomats in brocade, missionaries holding their breath, and at the far end of the room, Eleni, seated on a simple wooden throne, wrapped in linen, wearing a face that gave away absolutely nothing. Because in addition to running an empire, suppressing rebellions, and gently terrorizing her own relatives, Eleni was Ethiopia's most important ambassador to the outside world. Tonight you step into her quiet diplomacy, equal parts charm, subtle defiance, and strategic gifts involving giraffes. Yes, giraffe. We will get there. You settle near one of the thick square columns. Eating cooler here, the stone has seen so much. Envoys from Cairo, spice merchants from India, anxious monks from Jerusalem. Ethiopia was never as isolated as the maps make it seem. In Elenian time it was right in the messy middle of the Red Sea trade routes, the Indian Ocean spice network, and a triangle of diplomacy between Europe, the Middle East, and Africa. And Eleni? She knew how to navigate it. She spoke at least 3 languages fluently, possibly 5 GS. Naturally, the sacred tongue, Arabic of course. Likely Armenian and Syriac. Some scholars even speculate she understood enough Portuguese to joke politely, not bad for someone who wasn't technically allowed to speak publicly on behalf of the throne. Technically? But when European envoys arrived, bearing maps of the Bordeaux continent and poorly translated Bibles, they expected a stern-faced emperor. Instead, they often found a queen with better maps and more fluent scripture quotes than they had. One letter from a Spanish Franciscan now housed in Seville refers to her as Bofetti, whose eyes know things, the not theological language, but it gets the point across. Eleni used her court as a stage, and her diplomacy as a slow-play performance. She would house foreign guests not in the royal chamber but in the monastery gardens, framed by vines, birdsong, and a suspicious number of monks who could hear everything. She served coffee before it was fashionable. She asked pointed questions. Is your king generous to widows? Do but your ships make offerings when they pass holy waters? Do. Not out of curiosity, but to test boundaries. Historians still argue whether Eleni initiated formal relations with Portugal or simply manipulated them into arriving when it suited her. What we do know. In the early 1500s, just as the Ottoman Empire was tightening its grip on the Red Sea, Ethiopia suddenly became very interesting to European powers, and Eleni, she did too panic. She sent a letter. Actually several. Some say she dictated them. Others say she wrote them herself, sealed them with wax bearing a lion face, and handed them off to trusted envoys. One even traveled disguised as a monk for months, moving between ports under different names. Her message to Europe, supple but clear. Ethiopia still stands. We are Christian. We have gold, spices, and horses. We remember your crusades. Come visit, bring gifts. And come they did. One of the most famous episodes involved a Portuguese ambassador named Pero da Covilhã, who journeyed across the Middle East into India and finally to the Ethiopian court. He expected resistance. Instead, he was invited to dinner, served a dish he could name, questioned about Lisbon harbour size, and then allowed to stay for years. Eleni used him gently as both translator and captive, source of maps, names, and European anxieties. When other nations inquired whether Ethiopia would support a joint Christian alliance against the Ottomans, Eleni smiled and sent back a gift. Giraffe? No, really. One was sent northward as a gift to the Sultan of Cairo, possibly to soften Ethiopia. Given position on border disputes, the animal caused a sensation. Children sang about it, foreign envoys wrote poems. And while everyone marveled at the tall, awkward creature, Elenian messengers finalized the regional grain trade deal that doubled Ethiopia in food stores before a drought. You don't need war elephants when you have excellent timing and the occasional Madak Maman. But her diplomatic gifts weren't all spectacle. She also sent illuminated manuscripts, hand-copied gospels, rare herbs, and perhaps most famously an icon of the Virgin Mary believed to date back to the early days of Christianity in Ethiopia. It wasn't just a religious gesture, it was a message. We were here long before your empires, and we be here after. You rest now on the edge of the room in central stone bench, where translators once sat cross-legged for hours puzzling over vowels, religious phrases, and trade terms. The queen insisted that every guest be understood, and that every message she sent was read aloud. Twice. Diplomacy in her hands was not grandstanding, it was precision. Even when she declined an alliance, she did so with so much flattery the other side barely noticed they'd been rejected. One rejected ambassador returned home with gold, papyrus, and a letter that praised his king as a jewel set in rain, which is lovely and also means nothing. And perhaps her greatest diplomatic success was keeping Ethiopia neutral enough to survive while the world burned around it. The Ottomans expanded. The Portuguese sailed further, empires rose and fell, but Ethiopia held. Why? Because Eleni knew how to stay interesting without becoming threatening. Therein, an old saying from a court, translated roughly, better to be the table where treaties are signed than the sword they sharpen them on. She made Ethiopia the table. And as you prepare to leave the hall of foreign audiences, a gentle wind flows in from the garden. It carries the faint scent of jasmine and dust, and for a moment you picture her again, not as a queen surrounded by armed guards, but as a hostess in a linen wrap, lifting a goblet and offering a toast in 3 languages. To peace, to patience, and to the quiet cunning joy of outlasting everyone else. The sun is dipped lower now, and as you walk along a colonnade lit only by flickering torchlight, you find yourself entering the quieter, softer side of the palace, the inner chambers, where prayer met policy, and rest was always half shadowed by strategy. The floor creaks faintly underfoot, a sound that makes the servants of memory lean in and whisper. This was Elenian sanctuary. Not a temple, not a throne. Room, a space between both, where faith wasn't just personal, it was political. Because tonight you settle into the most intimate part of Elenian's story, her relationship with the church. And trust me, this isn't your average story of pious donations and solemn hymns. The Ethiopian Orthodox Tewahedo Church was and still is a unique and powerful institution. In Elenian time it held authority that rivaled kings. Its bishops weren't just spiritual guides, they were landowners, judges, and gatekeepers of salvation. The wrong bishop could ruin an emperor, the right monk could calm a rebellion. Eleni understood this. More importantly, she respected it, but she also knew how to manage it. Settled near a low wooden altar, its surface worn smooth by centuries of folded hands. This is where she prayed, yes, but also where she planned. Because in her world prayer and politics were never separate, they were parallel paths that often crossed at just the right moment. The queen's spiritual advisor was a monk named Tekle Hymenot. Not that Tekle Hymenot, the legendary saint, but a later namesake who was just as sharp and considerably more opinionated. He lived in the palace for nearly 2 decades, reportedly sleeping on a wooden board and reading scripture upside down when bored. Eleni trusted him because he never asked for anything except quiet. That, and the occasional chance to argue doctrine with passing bishops. Together they shaped the Kochian religious life into something equal parts reverent and relevant. Eleni didn't host long, tiresome sermons. She preferred short prayers and long discussions. Once when a visiting cleric began a 2-hour speech on angelic hierarchies, she is rumored to have interrupted with, "Oh yes, yes. And what does Michael think of our irrigation?" Even now scholars argue whether she was more devout or more practical. But most agree on this. She strengthened the church, not by glorifying it, but by making it work. She rebuilt crumbling monasteries. Boldly if the monks agreed to teach writing to local children, she financed pilgrimations, but required returning pilgrims to report what they had seen in other kingdoms. She distributed icons and relics, not to show off her piety, but to secure loyalty in border regions. In short, Eleni treated religion like the divine postal service, capable of delivering faith, news, and influence all at once. You lean against the stone wall where a simple carving of a cross is stuck behind a curtain of ivy. The symbolism is clear. In Eliade, Ethiopia, faith was present, but often tucked behind politics, always nearby, always waiting to be called upon. One of her boldest moves came during a theological crisis over a minor doctrinal dispute that naturally everyone took very seriously. The disagreement centered on whether certain Old Testament purity laws should be followed by Christians. Monks were furious, bishops debated, one even threatened to leave his post and join a desert order where no women spoke. Eleni went solution. She convened a council. But not just any council, she held it in the palace kitchens. She fed the monks lentils, honey bread, and locally grown grapes. Then before the debates resumed, she had them all wash each other feet by the end of the day. No one remembered what they were arguing about, except of course that she had chaired the meeting and not a single bishop had objected. Her power was allowed. It was woven into rituals. When the court needed rain, Eleni led the prayers. When a governor fell ill, she sent priests, who were also nurses and citrus fruits. When the empire teetered between war and diplomacy, she sent monks to carry her letters, knowing that no one would harm a man holding a cross. One of her most lasting contributions was the restoration of the Debradamo monastery, accessible only by rope, perched high on a flat-top mountain. Eleni ordered it repaired, funded a scriptorium, and sent a single golden censer inscribed with her name. That censer still exists, and to this day every monk who lives there prays daily for Board Queen, who knew how to ask heaven nice. Now you pass into a long hallway lined with religious murals, many of them some just outlines. One shows Mary cradling a child. Another shows St. George slaying a dragon that looks suspiciously like a crocodile. One, just faint enough to miss, shows a woman in white standing behind a lion, her hand resting on its mane. No name, no inscription, but everyone knows who it is. Eleni, what? Trying to become a saint. She was trying to keep saints relevant. She rewrote the calendar to match agricultural cycles. She suggested that feast days include community service. Once, when a bishop complained that a festival had grown too rowdy, she smiled and said, "But perhaps heaven prefers laughter." Historians still debate the depth of her theological knowledge. Some believe she read obscure texts in secret. Others suggest she simply asked the right questions at the right time and let the scholars chase their tails. Either way, the effect was the same. A church more flexible, more rooted in daily life, and more loyal to her than to any emperor who followed. And perhaps the most profound shift of all, she modeled a kind of quiet, unshakable faith that didn't need spectacle. She didn't need to weep during prayers or fast publicly. She just showed up every day and made sure the prayers matched the policies. You pause now in a cloistered courtyard, where a small spring bubbles quietly into a stone basin. 18 said Eleni came here at dawn most mornings, just before the palace awoke. She just sat. Sometimes she would trace letters in the water. Sometimes she would simply listen. 2 birds. 2 monks chanting, to the breath of a kingdom at peace you now. And in that peace you begin to understand, her greatest miracle was the defeating enemies. It was aligning faith and governance so backing and that no one questioned which was which. And in doing so, she didn't serve God. She served the people who spoke in His name. The breeze has quieted as you enter one of the most curious places in the palace, the workshop, not the armory, not the treasury, but the room where craftsmen hammered, carved, wove, and tinkered their way through the empire and quieter revolutions. Here, behind walls of sun-baked stone, surrounded by the scent of cedar shavings and warm beeswax, Eleni helped reshape a nation new sandal, one manuscript, one carved water jug at a time. Because tonight we follow the thread of Elimisan innovation, and it leads not through war councils or prayer halls, but through the very practical magic of everyday objects. You kneel beside a workbench. The wood is deeply grooved, the marks of chisels and ink-stained thumbs. This was no showroom. This was a laboratory of problem-solving, and under Elenian guidance, it became one of the most quietly powerful engines in the kingdom. She was an inventor in the modern sense, but she knew inventors. She invited craftspeople to court, not just artists or builders, but tinkerers, metalworkers, wood-turners, even a man who made stringed instruments from tortoise shells. Some she found during her travels, others came by rumor, a few arrived uninvited and were welcomed anyway. One of her first acts as regent, establishing a permanent artisan's sands quarter in the palace complex. It was the flashy, it didn't come with trumpets, but it meant something. It meant Eleni wasn't just interested in running the empire. She wanted to improve it. Take agriculture, for example. Eleni encouraged experimentation with irrigation channels, simple stone-lined ditches that redirected mountain springs to dry valleys. It was the revolutionary. It was boring. And it saved thousands of lives during the dry years that followed. One old record mentions her inspecting a prototype plow made from recycled bronze, declaring it more pleasantly stubborn, but harmofed. The inventor was rewarded with a small plot of land, and every field in his region doubled its yield within 2 years. Historians still debate how much of this was her direct doing. Did she understand the mechanics? Did she sketch designs? Or was she simply smart enough to fund the right people and leave them alone? Either way it worked. Eleni believed that comfort was not a sin. She did to worship austerity. She did not see virtue in poorly designed sandals or scratchy wool cloaks. She saw poverty not as a test of faith, but as a problem with a solution. Which brings us to one of the strangest items in her court, the portable bed. Not a royal indulgence. A solution to a very specific problem. During her early years of travel, Eleni realized that local officials often insisted on hosting her in uncomfortable drafty houses, where the only sleeping surfaces were hay bales or 2 short wooden slabs. Her response: commissioning a foldable bed made from palm wood and leather, designed to be carried by a single donkey. So these beds became status symbols for traveling governors. Eleni encouraged this. A well-rested official is less likely to start a rebellion, she joked, and while scholars debate the exact model, the principle remains. Comfort as control. You examine a small tool left behind our fine chisel, used for inscribing prayers on wooden panels, tiny, nearly weightless but essential. Ian Nearn Palis produced not only tools and trinkets but knowledge. She revived the art of manuscript illumination, importing rare pigments, teaching court scribes to blend colors so vibrant they still shine through faded parchment. And she did it. She ordered illustrated psalms for distant monasteries, gifted scrolls to villagers who had no books, even had her artisans create small etched teaching tablets, lightweight slates used to teach children the alphabet and multiplication. One such tablet, now housed in a dusty museum, bears a tiny carved sun in the corner, her symbol perhaps, or just a doodle. This was a quiet rebellion against ignorance. Make beauty common. Eleni even encouraged the development of a rudimentary water clock, used to time prayer intervals when the sun was hidden by clouds. It wasn't particularly accurate, but that didn't matter. What mattered was the intention, marking time with something other than guesswork. And perhaps the most charming footnote of her workshop legacy, the bees. Bees. Eleni was fascinated by them. Not just for honey, but for what they symbolized. Discipline, quiet labor, order without cruelty. She had hives installed near the palace gardens and commissioned wax specialists to refine candle-making processes. These beeswax candles burned cleaner, longer, and didn't leave that awful smoke trail that stung the eyes during long prayers. One court record from the year 1503 lists her donation of fiti and 4 wax candles of the Highland bees. Good for eyes and song. But what kind of song no one knows. But imagine a queen thinking about the air quality of her chapel centuries before anyone invented the word parasol. You lean against the wall and notice something strange. An iron hook embedded just above eye level. It's not decorative. It was once used to hang tools or lanterns. You imagine a young apprentice here swinging a blade too wide, getting scolded by a wrinkled craftsman with sawdust in his eyebrows. This was Ethiopia. Not just kings and battles, but lamp hooks and sandals, foldable beds and teaching tablets. She understood something many rulers never do. Grand empires are only as strong as the little things that make life bearable. Historians still argue about her impact on born technological development. To some claim she simply preserved traditions, others insist she fostered a true renaissance. But one fact is beyond debate. During her rule, quality of life improved, not just for nobles, but for the common people. Why? Because she paid attention to the boring stuff. And in doing so, she made sure Ethiopia wasn't just enduring, it was thriving. Not through spectacle, not through conquest. Through stitching, carving, planting and bees. It emerged now from the workshop wing into a narrow sloping hallway that dips gently downward toward the kitchens. But this isn't just about roasted lamb and barley stew. No, tonight you enter the domain of domestic power. Because Eleni, ever the strategist, knew that real rule was not only built in council chambers or whispered in monasteries. Sometimes it simmered quietly next to a pot of lentil. This section is about food rituals and the hidden logistics of ruling a kingdom where a feast could make or break a rebellion. And if you were hungry, well, brace yourself. You're about to learn how a well-spiced goat soup saved the province. The first thing you notice as you step inside, the air is warmer, thicker, still perfumed with traces of herbs, long dried up, coriander, fenugreek, garlic crushed by a mortar, worn smooth by centuries of meals and murmured confessions. This isn't just a kitchen. This is a nerve center. Eleni treated food not just as sustenance, but as currency. She fed her soldiers well. She fed her monks better. And she fed her enemies just enough to remind them who was doing the feeding. Under her reign, the palace kitchens became a complex machine. She assigned entire provinces to produce specific food items, new region for honey, another for grain, another for rare herbs grown only on high cliffs and harvested by young boys tied to ropes. Yes, really, the same rope system used for cliffside churches was also used for oregano. The result? A cuisine both luxurious and deeply local. Though imported truffles or swan pastries here, Eleni was interested in what impressed Europe. She wanted what kept people alive, alert and loyal. Each meal had meaning. When she served fish, it meant peace with the river tribes. When she served wild game, it signaled a victory or new alliance. When she served simple flatbread and lentils, that was either mourning or warning. One official reportedly fainted after being served only boiled teff and water. He thought he was being demoted. Turned out the grain shipment was late. But the symbolism stuck. Now the kitchens weren't just about feeding the queenian table. They were a model for the entire kingdom. Eleni sponsored palace-trained cooks to travel across Ethiopia, teaching villages how to preserve food for drought seasons, how to ferment grains to avoid illness, and, perhaps most cleverly, how to cook with fewer spices during famine, to avoid suspicion of hoarding. You pass now through the grain cellars. Collar, wyatt, lined with woven baskets taller than a grown man. Each one carefully catalogued, dated, and blessed. Eleni instituted regular grain counts, the way other rulers reviewed troops. She believed hunger was more dangerous than any sword, and she was right. Historians still debate how much of Ethiopia's instability during her rule came from military strategy versus food distribution. What we do know. During a particularly brutal dry season, Eleni ordered the palace gardens converted to communal plots. Courtiers were instructed to grow carrots and onions. Anyone caught planting flowers was reassigned to latrine duty. Therein even a preserved letter from a visiting Nobolese scribe complaining that the queen burn requires her guests to water the vegetables. Eleni, in the margin, is said to have written, "Bah, good keeps them honest." But food was than just a practical tool, it was deeply spiritual. Feasting and fasting in the Ethiopian Orthodox calendar were carefully woven into the kingdom BIM rhythm. Eleni honored every holy day, but she also interpreted them with a certain flexibility. On St. Marian Day, she insisted that feasts include dishes prepared by women alone. During Lent, she allowed sick soldiers extra rations of bean paste and honey water, arguing that both God prefers healing to rule following. Some clerics disagreed. Eleni smiled, handed them a basket of warm bread, and changed the subject. "You rest now on a low stone bench near the hearth. The ash has long since cooled, but the stories haven't. Here it," Teen said. She once sat for hours watching a cook perfect a new method of baking flatbread using hot river stones. She later had it introduced in military camps, flatbread that cooked faster, stayed fresh longer, and could be carried into battle. That one minor change likely saved thousands from starvation during campaign season. And speaking of campaigns, Eleni pioneered what we might call the first royal mobile pantry. She outfitted military caravans with dedicated food wagons, each with a trained cook and at least one apprentice. The result? Soldiers who didn't survive long marches, but marched back braising the stews. Therein, a joke, preserved in a letter from one general, "But Her Majesty's army has more aprons than arrow," maybe an exaggeration. But maybe not. Even her punishments involve food. One minor official accused of bribery, once imprisoned, he was made to serve meals to the palace guards for an entire month under close supervision. "May he learn the cost of feeding those he meant to betray," Comte reportedly said. And perhaps her most poetic use of food, a peace treaty sealed with a meal of often nothing but shed salt. The salt was broken between the two rival families. No utensils, just fingers, a bowl, and silence. The feud ended. No one remembers the details of the treaty. Everyone remembers the salt. You rise now and walk slowly through a narrow passage behind the ovens. A mosaic, faded but still visible, shows a lion sharing a loaf with a dove. No caption, just symbolism. And something to eat? Eleni knew that empire didn't run on titles. It ran on what filled stomachs and soothed nerves. Food was a message, a peace offering, tea, a memory. And every recipe carried a signature hit, if it was just a quiet note on a spice balance or a reminder that both the sauce must never be louder than the bread. That's how she ruled. Subtly, generously, and always, with enough to go around. The light outside has deepened into twilight now, and the palace seems to sigh, like a great stone lion finally settling into sleep. You follow the curve of a corridor that narrows into a staircase worn smooth by generations of sandals, bare feet, and a quiet urgency of messengers. This path leads not to grand halls or sunlit gardens, but to the royal quarters, private, protected, and deeply personal. This is where Eleni dreamed, and perhaps plotted. And tonight to step quietly into her world after hours. The life she led when the courtiers had gone, the scrolls were tucked away, and the empire, the pulse, slowed to a murmur. You pass under a low arch hung with what chin left of embroidered linen, and enter a room built for sleeping, but rarely used that way. The royal chamber was Spartan, even by monastic standards. A low wooden bed, a carved chest, a single stool, and on one wall a mural so faint it nearly blends into the plaster, a lion, curled at the feet of a woman cloaked in white. And something about seeing where a queen actually slept. But try to, that makes everything else feel more fragile. Because herein the quiet truth. Ruling was lowly. Eleni bade it to remarry. She did take a lover. And the whispers swelled. Always though no evidence suggests anything more than the occasional letter, the occasional long walk with a trusted advisor, the occasional pause in the garden when no one else was looking. She raised sons who weren't hers, ruled with men she didn't trust, and slept alone most nights in a room where the walls kept no secrets. And yet, she endured. Each night before retiring, she is said to have walked barefoot across the mosaic tiles of her prayer room, not for piety, for grounding. "A cold stone reminds me I still live," she told a physician once. Her bedtime rituals were minimal but precise: rose water for her hands, a cup of boiled herbs for her stomach, and always, a single candle, left burning until the first bird call. Not for fear of darkness, for reading. Because Eleni read constantly. Court records mention over 200 manuscripts in her personal collection: scripture, chronicles, herbal treatises, legal compendiums, and one peculiar volume called the Stars, Sadness, which no one has fully translated. It might have been poetry or astronomy, or both. And she annotated everything in the margins. Tiny J. West script, but ask about this bar. Bun too cruel, cheaper. Beautiful, but far. Bun, could this be done with rope instead? Some believe her scribbled questions guided imperial policy. Others think she just liked arguing with monks via parchment. And speaking of monks, several kept vigil outside her quarters every night, not just for protection, for counsel. If a troubling dream woke her, she would ask them to interpret it. One monk recorded in his journal, "But she dreamed of rivers running uphill. She ordered new canals the next morning." Historians still argue whether Eleni believed in omens. Watching clear, she believed in possibilities. One such possibility: teaching women. In her quarters, behind a faded curtain, lay a smaller room known as the Queenian Library. Not a vast vault of ancient scrolls, just a quiet alcove with shelves, a desk, and seats low to the floor. And once a week, it filled with women, noble daughters, midwives, scribes, sick wives, handpicked by Eleni to learn reading, arithmetic, and the habits of thought, as she called them. She did advertise this. She did tafra nta. She called it preparation. Because she knew Nungdai, one of those girls, might become queen, or steward, or something newer. And Eleni, more than anyone, believed in readiness. One girl named Mebrat went on to become a royal architect. Another wrote the first known Amharic prayer manual authored by a woman. A third, she vanished from the records, but not before signing her name in one of Eleni handbooks, right below a note that read, "Botanem, let her speak first next time you pause by the bed now." The frame creaks as if remembering its weight. A single carved lion foot is slightly chipped, bore some belief, from when Eleni kicked it after receiving bad news. Others say she stubbed her toe. Either way, it stayed that way. She liked her imperfections untouched. The Queenian personal staff, 4 women, 2 eunuchs, 1 elderly nurse, recorded that she slept lightly, woke often, and usually rose before dawn already dressed, already writing. When asked once why she slept so little, Eleni replied, "But because there are others who dream for me, I must be awake to greet them." Poetic. Yes. A little sad, also, yes. But that ching. The paradox of power: it doesn't leave when the candles go out. It lingers, whispers, rattles around in the corners of your mind like a draft you can't shut out. And yet she managed softness. Her nightstand, just a wooden box, really held dried flowers sent from distant provinces, a feather quill from a hawk raised by one of her grandsons, a smooth river stone carved with a single word, Semem, or by stillness. She held that stone when her hands trembled. When her eldest foster son died of fever far from home, she didn't mourn in public. But for 6 nights the palace scribe recorded her waking every hour, lighting a candle, and staring into the dark without speaking. Even queens need grief. Even queens need quiet. And perhaps above all, Eleni understood that legacy isn't built in daylight. It's shaped in moments like this, barefoot in silence, scribbling half-formed thoughts in the margin of a book no one else has read. You sit now beside her old stool, tracing a crack in the floor that Jun slowly widened over the centuries. Time leaves its marks, but so do queens. And somewhere, faintly, as if through the stone itself, you hear the flutter of a page turning. She's still reading. Now, as night settles firmly over the palace, and the wind sighs through the upper eaves, you ascend once more, this time to a place rarely visited, higher than the throne room, more remote than the chapel. You climb a narrow winding staircase that seems to loop forever, until finally you step onto a wide-open rooftop dam place known in old records as Bun Alenian View. This was her watchtower. Her place to think, to observe, to remember that empires look smaller from above. And from here, under stars so bright they feel almost solid, you come to understand how Eleni saw her world, not just as a ruler, but as a strategist. A woman who always played the long game. She was not born to rule. She did to inherit a crown or receive prophecies in her cradle. She climbed carefully, quietly, every step calculated, every alliance weighed like gold dust. And from this height, it's easy to see why she did it her way. The capital of the time, likely one of several seasonal royal encampments near modern-day Embarkation, sprawled below. Gardens, stone enclosures, the glint of water jars. At night, it all blended into a living mosaic. Fires, flickering voices carrying dogs barking distantly, a kingdom breathing in its sleep. Eleni stood here often. She didn't need maps. She had memory. She could point from this very rooftop to every governor-ran estate, every rebel band hideout, every border that needed strengthening. One legend says she once stood here, and without consulting a scroll, dictated the boundaries of 3 provinces to a young scribe. Use the mountains as a spine, she said. But let rivers be veins. The land must live, not just obey. Historians still argue whether Eleni was a bold military leader. She did wear armor. She rarely rode into battle. But she commanded generals, chose targets, set ration limits, even ordered troops to build trenches shaped like the glyph for Buendos. So maybe not a general, but certainly the mind behind the blade. One campaign in particular, the quiet suppression of a rebellion in the Northern Highlands, is often called her masterpiece. She avoided bloodshed, used false letters and misdirection to confuse the rebel leaders, and promised land reform to starving farmers. Within 6 months, the uprising vanished, and Eleni never had to fire a shot. Her enemies called her Bongta silent rain. But it sounded lovely. It meant, of course, that by the time you realized Shigu moved against you, your fire was already out. From this rooftop, she charted trade routes, to knowing full well that roads carried more than goods. They carried rumors, influence, dreams. She commissioned roads between monasteries and market towns, ensuring monks would talk to merchants, and vice versa. It sounds like a recipe for chaos. It turned out to be a recipe for cohesion. One of her lesser-known strategies: hosting market fairs on the same day as major religious festivals. People came to pray. They left with blankets, salt, new shoes, and ideally, a better opinion of the crown. She even restructured the postal system. The runner system. Messages in her court were delivered not by horses but by fleets of barefoot runners trained to cover vast distances with almost no rest. Eleni doubled their pay, gave them breast stations, etutted wax-sealed messages to prevent tampering. And the result? She knew things faster than anyone else. Itban said she once had news of an attempted coup before the conspirators themselves were fully convinced to commit it. But power isn't to it knowing. It's on knowing what to ignore. Eleni understood this too. She let some minor rebellions fizzle out on their own, rather than lend them legitimacy with royal attention. She refused to punish a courtier accused of heresy, saying simply, "But at the wind tests his flame." He later joined a monastery and became a skilled beekeeper. Sometimes her patience was mistaken for passivity, and that was her favorite kind of mistake. You pause now beside the low parapet, 18 cool to the touch, warm by sun, chill by night. There are notches carved into the stone, just wide enough to rest an elbow. Maybe hers, maybe someone before her. But you can see it. The queen standing here wrapped in a thick shawl, staring into the valley where smoke curls from cook fires, and wondering what comes next. Because herein the truth, Eleni never ruled for applause. She ruled for after. Her policies were built to last beyond her life. Her roads, her grain laws, her chosen successors, even her burial place, now a modest mountain crypt, but was chosen to remind future rulers that no one sits forever. One document Vante, barely preserved, records her saying to a visiting priest, "But I will not for today, but for when my name is forgotten." Boah. The name was not forgotten, but the intention holds. Her greatest legacy once to be remembered was the Ethiopia she left behind, literate, stable, well-fed and just independent enough to frustrate every European power that tried to meddle. Historians still debate how she managed it all. Some say she ruled through fear, others say she ruled through love, most likely through observation. She watched, she listened, she waited. And from this rooftop you can see how that worked. The lights below flicker like embers, the mountains beyond fade into velvet somewhere. An owl calls. And do you realize? Eleni Dintie, Liet Grand Monument. She had this view. And tonight, so do you. The night deepens. The stars above now feel close enough to pluck from the sky, like ripe fruit on a low-hanging branch. You descend slowly from Millennium rooftop perch, back through the narrow halls, past the sleeping quarters, past the kitchens long gone quiet, and down into a space few ever entered. This is not a chamber of war or worship. This is her archive. And tonight you open the drawers of Elnian memory in the quiet rooms where her thoughts, letters, secrets, and strategies were stored, because while many rulers fought with swords, Eleni favored something quieter, parchment. The Royal Archive 1. Tab vast in size, no scroll towers or endless shelves. Instead it was meticulous, compact, and arranged in a way that historians still haven't too fully decoded. Wooden drawers carved with symbols, some astrological, others botanical, a few animal-based, divided records by theme rather than year. A drawer marked with a lion and tail contained royal decrees. A drawer carved with a fig leaf held letters from governors. A feather indicated foreign correspondence, and the one marked with a weeping sun, personal. You pulled open. Brittle pages, sealed bundles of palm leaf script, and folded bits of parchment that smell faintly of frankincense and ink. This is where Eleni recorded the empire heartbeat. One of her habits was writing letters to herself. Some were practical lists of things to check, people to watch, mistakes to remember. Others were more intimate, reflections on aging, on loyalty, on whether one could ever truly retire from responsibility. These were not meant to be read by anyone else. One letter reads, "But I have governed long enough to know when someone smiles too often, it and never good." Another simply says, "But I miss the green hills, they do not miss me." And then there are the letters she never sent. Tucked in a cloth pouch are 4 unsent scrolls. One to a European priest who offended her by calling Ethiopia a Bon's spiritual cousin what? Another to her former rival in the northern provinces, a third to her younger self, and the last to no one, or perhaps to all of us. It ends with boy. But if they forget my name, let them remember my shade. Historians still argue about these letters. Some believe they're forgeries, others call them a private journal disguised as statecraft. Whatever their origin, they reveal a mind that refused to rest. This archive also held records of dreams. Dreams. Eleni required her attendants to write down any vivid dreams she had and file them by lunar cycle. Not out of superstition, at least not entirely, but to spot patterns. If the same bird returns in sleep, she once said, perhaps I should listen. Some dreams led to decisions. One recurring dream of floods prompted a river wall project. Another of spinning wheels led her to reform the palace transport carts to use larger wheels and smoother axles. A trivial change, not when it doubled the speed of grain delivery. But most curiously, this room held records of silence, moments when messages did not arrive. Eleni tracked delayed reports, missing couriers, unexplained pauses in diplomatic exchanges. These gaps, she believed, said as much as the letters themselves. One match a note, but no word from Adao in 3 months. Prepare for noise, and she was right. When war did come, she was surprised. She's already drawn up supply lines, appointed replacement governors, and relocated 3 border monasteries before the first battle was even declared. This was her genius. Not prediction. Preparation. You brush your hand along a row of small wooden tokens. Early administrative tools used to mark tax obligations, land claims, and food stores. Eleni had them carved by blind monks, saying they understood touch better than anyone. The tokens were coded by shape, not color, to be read even in darkness. Some scholars believe this system influenced early Ethiopian coin design. Others think it was just a smart way to avoid forgeries. Either way, it worked. Near the corner you find a basket of torn-up paper. Scraps, not garbage, evidence. These were trials, drafts, words tested and discarded. One note, half-burned, reads, "But too harsh. Mercy works longer." Another says, "But too soft. Justice needs teeth." Even her indecision was deliberate. Among the more peculiar items here, a dried orange peel from a gift sent by a Yemeni merchant, a broken comb once owned by a visiting scholar, a small copper mirror inscribed with the words, "But what you see is never all." Some say she placed these in the archive as reminders. Others say they were offerings to memory, quiet anchors in the sea of paper and time. You settle now on a low stool beside the main chest. This is where the state records live: treaties, tax reforms, building plans. Eleni reviewed these herself. Weekly, no delegation. "But if a law carries my name, it must pass my eyes," she insisted. That level of scrutiny may sound exhausting, but to Eleni it was control and comfort. Her kingdom might shift, enemies might rise, but the numbers, the ink, that was solid. Her archive was not just for reference. It was her reality check, a secret weapon. And maybe her diary disguised as empire. Historians still debate whether this room was open to others. Some say her grandsons read here by her side. Others say only one trusted scribe was ever allowed in. But everyone agrees on this. Without this room, Eleni and Ethiopia might have crumbled. Because you can fight wars, win battles, sign alliances. But it is what you remember and what you write down that builds a legacy. And Eleni, she remembered everything. The corridors are nearly silent now. Even the wind seems to have curled itself into sleep. You step out from the archives and follow a dimly lit path into a part of the palace rarely spoken of in royal chronicles. The place of illness, of aging, of letting go. Because tonight you enter the final stretch of Eleni's Zen journey. The quiet tapering of a brilliant, burdensome life. This is where her reign slows. But her story deepens. Eleni lived into her 80s that miracle. Considering the time, the stress, and the sheer number of meals she skipped in favor of writing long memos. She'd eating die in battle, or from poisoning, or surrounded by court intrigue. She faded, slowly, deliberately, like a candle, allowed to burn out on its own wick. And here in the Queen modest convalescence chamber, you feel the weight of that. The stone is colder, the ceiling's lower, but the windows wider. She wanted to see the sky. Even at the end, she preferred sunrise to sleep. There are stories of her final years, most of them wrapped in soft legend. Some say she moved into a smaller residence within the palace, attended only by a nurse, a scholar, and her favorite gardener. Others claim she relocated briefly to a hilltop retreat, where she would spend hours watching ants build colonies in the dirt. She stopped ruling, not really. Her formal regency may have ended, but she advised her grandson, Emperor Lebna, well into her final decade, often in letters, often in riddles. One surviving note reads, "But when the river floods, build not walls but bridges, unless it's in a metaphor." Tender boat. Eleni had a reputation for being sharp even when her body weakened. A court physician recorded. But she forgets no name, no number, and no mistake, especially her own. She accepted the slow decline of her hands, her eyesight, her appetite, but not her clarity. And she never pretended she was immortal. One of her last public decrees was the construction of a new burial chapel, not for herself, but for unnamed women who had served in wars, on councils in monasteries. The chapel walls bear no names, just carved silhouettes. One of them, oddly enough, looks quite a lot like Eleni. But that's just speculation. Shizu probably smirk at it. She began to give away things quietly. A prayer bowl here, a shawl there. She ordered several of her annotated books to be copied by hand and sent to far-off churches. She even gifted her spare bed, the foldable one. A retired general who once confessed that his knees popped but like roasting millet when he stood. You deserve better rest. But she told him. Her nights grew quieter, her dreams gentler. The last one she recorded, scribbled in a shaking hand, mentioned a great black bird circling above a tree but never landing. No fear, just watching, waiting. She called it Abba. Beautiful sort of warning. She never called for a grand farewell. No final speech, no dramatic lighting, but word spread. Governors came quietly to kneel outside her room. Monks chanted. Distant chiefs sent dried flowers and spiced grain. A potter walked 100 miles to place a clay lion at her door. She never saw it, but someone whispered the gift to her, and she smiled. Her breast slowed, her fingers once so quick with ink and bread dough and prayer beads, finally stilled. One dawn without ceremony she left. The nurse said it was peaceful, the scholar cried, the gardener reportedly didn't say a word for 3 days. And the palace? It simply kept moving. Because that's in what Eleni built, a machine that did teach her and need her to keep working. Her burial was quiet, just as she wished, a highland crypt, simple stone, no gold, no grand statues. But people came from everywhere, not just nobles, farmers, midwives, teachers. Children who had grown up on the grain policies she implemented. Women who had learned to read under the cover of her silence. And herein the oddest part. No official portrait survives of her. Just a few rough sketches scattered across forgotten scrolls. In one, she holding a lily. In another, she seated beside a lion. None quite match. But if you ask the locals of those northern valleys, they will tell you her face is still there, in the way the roads curve gently downhill, in the way the wheat ripens evenly on both sides of the hill, in the quiet between bells at sunset. Historians still argue over her legacy. Some call her a regent, others a queen. Some claim she was conservative, others radical. A few suggest she was simply practical, too practical to chase glory. But maybe that's in her greatest trick. She never had to chase glory. She made it walk barefoot and quiet right beside her. And tonight in this still room you realize she never really gone. She folded into the walls, into the scrolls, into the lives that still run on the systems she shaped. Not a ghost, not a saint, just a woman who outlasted nearly everything built to erase her. And didn't even flinch. You've wandered long tonight, through kitchens and war rooms, chapels and rooftops, archives and dreams. But as the final stretch begins, you find yourself in a space that doesn't quite appear on any palace map. Not a throne room, not a library, just a long open veranda perched on the eastern slope, facing the place where light first touches the hills. This was where Eleni sat in the very early mornings. Before the bells, before the scribes, before anything needed solving. This was where she watched. And in that watching we begin to understand something deeper. Eleni was Jesus powerful. She was patient. She once wrote, but most problems solve themselves if left in the sun. And here, surrounded by bird calls and distant bleats from goats, you see what she meant? She ruled for 40 years. Not all at once, not in the same sea, not even always with the same title. But 40 years of steering Ethiopia through storms and silence alike. A woman without a crown but with a sharper mind than most kings. Our regent, in name, a sovereign in spirit. And she knew exactly what she was doing. Historians like to make categories. Was she a religious leader? A military strategist? A reformer? A caretaker? Yes, and more. She was a cartographer of human nature. She mapped the fears of her enemies, the desires of her allies, the hungers of her people. She could tell when a merchant was lying by the speed of his bow. She could spot a weak governor by how tightly he held his cloak in the wind. She didn't need magic. She had observation. She didn't need fame. She had legacy. And she didn't need to win every battle, just enough to keep peace breathing. Even her name Eleni wasn't entirely hers. She was born with a different name, possibly Bohatasaya. Fath adopted the Christian title upon marriage, tying herself not just to a man, but to a system of belief. Not blind faith, selective, thoughtful belief, one shaped more by daily bread and sunrise rituals than fiery sermons. And in that measured belief, she found both armor and compass. The empire she helped shape was not immune to hardship. Famines came, borders shifted, invasions tested the unity she worked so hard to build. But the bones she laid, roads, rain laws, schools, and memory, held firm. Even centuries later, Ethiopian leaders have cited her as a model: quiet authority, moral clarity, stoic patience. One modern writer said, Eleni did not write her name in flame. She carved it in the shade, where it would last longer. You look out now over the distant hills, dim outlines against the lightning sky. Somewhere beyond those peaks, traders are waking, monks are stirring, children are yawning, unaware that the schools they walk to exist because a queen once decided girls needed letters too. And maybe that's what makes Eleni so extraordinary. She didn't rule for admiration. She ruled for continuity. She was loud, she was lasting. She did to seek credit, she sought stability. Even her failures, because yes, there were some, were the kind that whispered rather than screamed. Ta, or treaty that did and how, my nephew proved disappointing. A region that never quite embraced her reform. But she learned, she adjusted, she kept walking. Always forward, always calmly. The palace she lived in, where you wandered all night, it now mostly ruined. Stones half swallowed by vines. Tiles, cracked and carried away. But if you close your eyes you can still hear it. The scribes murmuring, the bees humming, the runners arriving breathless with news. A queen, seated at a wide table, sleeves rolled up, studying a map with a chipped teacup beside her elbow. You remember the sandals she improved, the plows she encouraged, the portable beds, the foldable teaching slates, the candles that didn't sting your eyes. Small things, forgettable things, unless you be the one who needs them. And that, perhaps more than her titles, her lineage, or her alliance, is what made Eleni unforgettable. She thought about you. She ruled for the soldier and the scribe, the child and the widow, the cook and the monk, the dreamer and the runner. She ruled for tomorrow, not just today. And in that she ruled longer than any crown could contain. And now the stars begin to pale. The world outside the window is softening, first in gray, then in the slow promise of blue. The Nietzschean quiet has done its work, holding you gently as history drifted past like the hush of silk on stone. Eleni is gone now, but not really. She's somewhere in the echoes, in the grain of paper left unwritten. In the silent nods of scholars who still try to guess how she outmaneuvered them all with a flick of a wrist and a patient smile. You may never walk through an Ethiopian highland palace. You may never sit at a lion-footed table or run your fingers over wax tablets marked with faded prayers. But you will be there tonight, in scent, in sound, in shadow. And as your breath slows and your limbs sink deeper into stillness, carry this with you. Yet history doesn't always shout. Sometimes it whispers. It builds quietly between sunrises and boiled grains, between sandals sewn by calloused hands and grain counted by sleepless eyes. It builds in the long silences of a woman who chose not to be a queen but to act like one anyway. And if you feel a little stronger tonight, a little more anchored, maybe a chance because you spent the evening in the company of someone who knew how to hold the world together without asking it to thank her. So rest now. Traverse Bay. Let the night fold over you like Elenivan, Olinim Shaw. And stronger than it looks,